Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and on this channel I expose you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. And tonight we have a really special night planned. We're talking about arguments against God's existence, and we're talking about tips or advanced tips on how to deal, or not deal with them, but analyze them and see where they go, what they do, how to think about them more deeply. And so the tips will be coming from an actual Christian philosopher. He's a good friend of mine, Dr. Josh Rasmussen. I have him here with me. He's a professor at Azusa Pacific University. He has interest in metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and a whole bunch of other cool things. His latest book, How Reason Can Lead to God. I think that's how it is, yeah. Some people have been actually reading it upside down. But How Reason Can Lead to God is something that's coming out pretty soon. Do I have that right? It's like just a couple days.
End of the month.
End of the month,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's the end of June right now in 2019, and this book is coming out in just a few days. So if you're watching it live, you'll have to wait. You can actually check for it in the description if you want to buy it and get it on pre-order. But if you're watching this in the future, then obviously you can buy it now. So just check the link in the description if you want to check out his latest book, which is really, really good. It's awesome. It has a lot of actually really, really nice endorsements. Here's one from Robert Koons. This is on the back of the book. Rasmussen's book is destined to be a modern classic. Rasmussen combines simplicity, clarity, and depth to an extraordinary degree, resulting in a book that makes some of the most advanced work in contemporary philosophical theology accessible to the general reader without sacrificing any logical precision. It's a pretty good endorsement there. And there's a bunch of others from J.P. Moreland, C. Stigman Evans, even William Lane Craig has commented on how great of a book it is. Highly, highly recommend that you guys pick this up if you're interested in his work and what he has to say tonight. It might interest you further to do that. So, and he also has a YouTube channel. So if you want to check out his channel, it's called Worldview Design. It's linked in the description of this video. You can just scroll down and find it. It's real easy to get. And make sure to subscribe to his channel as well. He's closing in on 1,000 subscribers. We want to try to get him over that. Well, let's get into the topic tonight. So what's going to happen basically is Josh is going to start going through a list of tips as a professional philosopher for analyzing arguments, and we're just going to get started. So why don't we go ahead? I'll just pass over to you, Josh, and we'll
Cool.
get started.
All right. Well, thanks, Cameron. So, one of my interests is in helping insights flow from person to person, no matter where those different people come from. So I'm sort of a bridge builder, and even in that book, it's about a bridge of reason that connects sort of one set of principles to a place where a lot of people who would hold that one set might not see where they lead initially. And so the reason why this is related to arguments is that I think of arguments as themselves tools for transferring insights across perspectives. Okay. And what I've noticed is that there are some ways, some strategies, some tips for analyzing arguments. And I can give advanced tips, but actually there are some just fundamental tips that if you know these, you'll be set apart like among 95% of people because, or maybe even 99% of people, because I see a lot of conversations, a lot of debates, and I see that most people do not know some of these basic techniques for how to analyze arguments. So I want to give you some tools for how you can analyze any argument. So if you're watching a political debate, you're reading some technical article, these are universal tools that you can use, and you can see, okay, is this a good argument?
And I'm going to jump in real
yeah.
quick. So what we're going to do is actually pass it over to you guys in the live chat, people that are live with us now. After he goes through some of these tips, we're going to pass over to you and write your little argument or your question or whatever objection is troubling you and write it in the live chat, and I'll try to pick up on it and we'll discuss and maybe apply some of these principles that he's going to lay out here and like it's to something more to something less abstract, I guess. So anyways, that's what we have planned later on. So
Yeah, and I just want to add, like, one of the reasons why I care about this is because I think that insights, if people can get better analyzing arguments, insights can flow from any group of people. I know I already kind of was hinting at that, but for me, this isn't about like empowering sort of one camp or one group of people. This really is about increasing the flow of insights across perspectives. Okay, so
that's actually important
yeah.
because we had somebody comment on our Facebook group. There's like, why are Christians always so worried about like refuting arguments? Why don't they care about the truth? And I think that's basically what you're pointing out here is that this.
Well,
doesn't
yeah, I
have
mean,
anything to do with that.
just today I got an email from somebody, and he had an argument against the existence of God. And one of the things I did in my response was to say, okay, I like what you're doing here. Is this a way of capturing your argument. And I just put it into a format. And then I took some of his reasons and I said how they actually support his premises. And then after that, I didn't reply. So like my goal was to help clarify the strength of his argument in that particular section, that particular exchange. I think that's very important because that's how insights flow. That's how we learn from each other. So, okay, so very quickly, so what is an argument? So I think it's helpful to think of an argument like a staircase that has steps that lead to a conclusion. So the goal is hopefully to help somebody take those steps to see something that's true. If it's a good argument, it will help them see that something is true. Okay. And then arguments have properties that are different from the steps or the pieces or the premises in the argument. And I think I just want to give you some terminology because this will help clarify some of the tools I'm going to give you. So first of all, you'll hear people say sometimes that if a premise is sound or a premise is valid, okay? But technically, validity and soundness don't apply to premises, but instead they apply to the staircase as a whole. Okay, so what is validity? The technical term for in logic is the argument is logically, deductively valid if those steps, if they're true, then that conclusion is true. Okay, so you have to like strain to think about that because you're asking, is the conclusion true if those steps are true? That would be validity. So the argument is valid if the steps actually would take you to the conclusion if they're true.
Let's bring this to reality with using a concrete example of an argument. You know, the Socrates is a pretty standard argument to go through, right? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man.
Yeah.
Therefore, Socrates is mortal.
Yes. If those premises are true, that conclusion is true. And then soundness will be the property of being valid, so the premises until the conclusion, and the premises are true. Okay. Sometimes people. So
you can have validity. In other words, you can have validity without soundness, right? You can have something that is valid if the premises are true, the conclusion would be true, but one of the premises is false.
Yes. And you can think of validity as kind of like the glue. So you're gluing all the pieces together so that if they're all true, that conclusion is stable. It's true too. And I always tell my students the one thing that you can guarantee this for every argument that you make is that it's valid. All you have to do is put it into a logically valid format, like the format that you just gave. You can have a format where the first premise is A, then if A, then B, therefore B. That's modus ponens. And if you have it in that format, then that conclusion is definitely going to be true if the premises are true. And so that's like step one of making a good argument. Make sure it's valid. And then the second step is to make sure that you're actually seeing that the premises are true or that you have good reasons to believe the premises. And hopefully your reasons will appeal to people who don't already believe the conclusion, right? Because I think that's the big challenge is how do you do that? So I just want to give you two quick tools, and then you can interact with me in applying these tools. But two quick tools to test any argument, to analyze any argument that comes your way. So somebody gives an argument, and I think the first thing you want to do is you want to think about how you can take their argument and organize it into that staircase where maybe they didn't state all their premises. So you figure out, okay, what are their premises? What's their conclusion? Slow that down and then state that argument.
I just want to point out real quick that how unnatural that is in conversation to like want to do that or to actually do it. And as I've like grown in apologetics and philosophy and thinking about arguments and critical thinking and etc., I've tried to apply some of these things in my everyday conversations, and it's a lot more difficult than it sounds.
Yes,
so like
it takes work.
Conversations with my wife, I'm like, well, let me see if I can think critically about what she's saying and try to put it in premise conclusion form and stuff. And it's like, it's a lot more difficult, as we're talking through these things, like these are really helpful tips, but it's going to take work to like really get good at them.
Yes. And I've noticed I'll listen to the radio and some of the best arguments have the form of one premise, and it's usually a true and obviously true premise. And then the conclusion, which actually didn't follow from the premise, but what wasn't stated is invisible to you because what wasn't stated is the inference. And that's not like a physical thing that you're seeing with your eyeballs. So it actually takes straining with your mind. You have to actually decide to look at the inference. I was having another conversation with somebody not too long ago where they set up a bunch of observations and then therefore their conclusion, which is unmistakable. We know that this is true. But what was missing in their argument was the inference from the premises to conclusion. And that's not just easy to see. You have to slow it down. It's abstract.
Yeah.
It's hard work. But the reward is that you have an argument that's going to be like a beautiful house that you can actually that's going to help you see what's true, that's stable. It's not going to just fall apart. Badly built houses turn people off, and nobody can trust you once you've built a house badly too many times. So you want to do that work. Yeah. So it comes down to two questions. Anytime you come up with an argument or somebody gives you an argument, there are just two fundamental questions to start with. Okay. So first question you want to ask is, does the conclusion follow from the premises? And depending on the context, most times it just doesn't. So, or there's the implicit premise that if those premises are true, then the conclusion is true. But then that if-then premise is deeply controversial or hard to support. So that's the first question to ask. And I've noticed that some of the hardest questions to find out the hardest arguments to find out what's wrong with them, if there is something wrong, is that they're not valid. Again, validity means the conclusion doesn't follow from those premises. And so I'll put an argument on the board, and I'll tell my students that for a crazy conclusion that everybody knows is false, but all the premises are true. And I'll ask the students, okay, come up with an objection to the argument. And sometimes they'll come up with objections to the conclusion.
Yeah.
But then I'll say, but this conclusion follows from the premises. So then they'll come up with objections to the premises, but it's hard because those actually were true premises. So I'll keep defending that argument until they're like, okay, something's wrong with it, but we don't know what it is. And the answer is, it's not a valid argument, right? So
the
those
conclusion
premises are
just
true.
doesn't follow.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you want to
can we break that down? Yeah. Can we break that down a little bit more, talking about validity? So how do we tell when an argument is valid or not? What are the tools to unpack that?
So I can give you a sufficient condition, right? So a sufficient condition would be if you can get the argument into the following form. Premise 1 looks like A. Premise 2 looks like premise. If A, then B, then therefore B is the conclusion. That's modus ponens. And you can get your argument into that form, and then if
let me restate that real quick, because
yeah.
I don't know if that was clear enough. So so premise 1, if A, then B. Premise 2 would be A, and then the conclusion would be B.
Yeah, right. So you switch the order of the premises.
Ponens.
Yeah, so it could be premise 1 could be A, then you could have if A, then B, or it could be premise 1 is if A, then B, then A. The order doesn't matter.
Yeah, whatever your preference is, I guess.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, I sometimes do ask people, like my students, like, how do you actually know that if, grass is green, and if grass is green, then grass has color, therefore grass has color? Like, how do you know that that's a valid form? And the reason why I ask them that is because we're at rock bottom. Like, you just see with your mind. It's not something you have independent evidence for. It's sort of presupposed in all reasoning. So this is one of the basic structures.
That brings up something interesting. I was talking with another philosopher today about how you can't escape circularity, at bottom.
Yeah, or at least something that's foundational. Something that's foundational. I hope that doesn't have to be circular. Maybe depends on how that gets defined. But yeah, something that's not.
Yeah, epistemic circularity, where you have to kind of assume that your cognitive faculties are reliable, kind of that kind of thing. And he was telling me that another philosopher had made a distinction between good circularity and bad circularity, essentially. But I don't want to derail us too far.
That's too tempting. I have to let that go because I do have a way of avoiding the circularity there. But maybe there's a good circularity. So okay, I just got to let that go. So
let it go.
Protect me from that. It's too interesting.
So we were talking. Yeah. So we were talking about validity. How do we tell when something's valid? And then you gave us one rule. This is called a rule of inference. A rule of inference, from what I know. So right. That's just one. That's one rule.
Yes,
modus ponens is.
It's one valid pattern, and then another one would be modus tollens, where you have if A then B, but then you say not B is the second premise, therefore not A. Okay, so
and famously, a lot of people who are watching this, the argument that Craig uses for morality, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2 is objective moral values and duties do exist, which is actually a negation of the negation. Of the negation. So it's technically a modus tollens there, but that's just another form, right, to sort of test validity. I think those are probably some of the two that you see most often, because people generally reason in these kind of conditional if-then statements, and then
those are simple forms, and you can always guarantee that your argument is valid or that somebody else's argument is valid by figuring out which premise might be missing or figuring out a translation of their argument so it takes that valid form. I think that people shouldn't have to debate over whether the argument is valid because there are these crystal clear forms, get them into that form, then you can isolate which premise is in question. So that, I mean, I said there's two questions. This first question, is the argument valid? And then here's a little tool for making it valid, is that will set you apart because most people don't know how to do that. They're not doing that. And that will really help you, make you more powerful in your thinking. Yeah.
So let's try to, do you want to stop and try to apply that to some concrete example, or do you want to move on to your next one?
Let me do the next one, and then you can help me think of examples. So, okay. I don't know.
Because you mentioned politics, and I kind of want to talk about politics.
Okay.
We don't normally do that here, but like
right.
we could use an example like that.
Let's come back to that. Yeah, let's do that. So the second question I always invite people to ask for any argument. Again, this works for any argument you encounter, which is what I love about these tools. They are universally applicable. Just ask this question: what reasons are there to believe each premise? So here you go through each premise and you say, okay, what reason is there to believe this? Why I think this is true, right? How do I know that? Or what evidence do I have for that premise? And you just go premise 1, premise 2, premise 3. And if you have reasons for each of the premises, then you have, from your own perspective, some weight of a reason to think the argument is a good argument. Okay. Now, it doesn't have to be knockdown proof, but it can have some kind of weight in your mind if you have reasons to believe the premises. Now, when you're asking whether a certain objection to an argument is a good objection, first you want to find out which premise in the argument it's targeting. Okay. And many objections don't even target any premise.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah. Maybe most. I mean, in popular culture, people raise objections, and usually it's just another argument, like against the conclusion. Yeah. And sometimes I just want to say, yeah, that's a good objection to the conclusion. Yes. Doesn't mean my argument for the conclusion was not good. Just means we've got two weights, and you have to weigh them both. And that's, I mean, I've said this to you before. It takes a mature mind. This is hard work, but to weigh the arguments on both sides, because it's so easy to sort of simplify. Like, well, if I've got a good argument over here, I can't have any other good arguments over here. Like, that's too much to handle.
Let me give an example of that real quick. So here's the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and this was part of the reason why we were even having this discussion, because of what happened with Rationality Rules and the responses and going back and forth. And this is not an objection that he raised in his video, but it's an objection that you hear from Richard Dawkins and other atheists sometimes. What happens a lot, I guess, is the who created God question. But let's look at the Kalam Cosmological Argument. The first premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause. Second premise is the universe began to exist. And then the conclusion is the universe therefore has a cause. And asking the question, who created God? Well, first of all, it's a question. It's not an argument, as most of the listeners watching know. But then also it doesn't target either one of the premises. It doesn't target premise 1, which is, again, everything that begins to exist has a cause. It doesn't target premise 2, that the universe began to exist. And so I think that's a good example showing that, like, sometimes objections just have nothing to do with the argument. But even still, it will still, like, take you aback and be like, okay, well, wait a second. Like, I need to think through this now. And how do I get out of this question or whatever? You know, and in reality, it didn't target either premise. And so it doesn't affect the argument at all.
Yes. I think sometimes it doesn't directly target the argument, but there is an insight in the background. And I think something that you can do that also sets you apart is if you really work hard to draw out their insight. Like, so the Richard Dawkins objection applied to the design argument, for example, like who designed the designer, can be translated into an undercutting defeater. I'll define that in a moment. To one of the premises, but it has to be translated. It's not just, a question isn't by itself an argument, but one thing you can do is work hard to see if you can translate that into the best form of the objection. And how do you do that? Well, you ask, which premise could be targeted by this question? What's behind the question, right? I think that helps to facilitate that insight transfer, because I know this is like my heart. I care so much about this because I feel like we do block the flow of insights to each other when we're like so quick to sort of score a dialectical point. Like, your question didn't even touch my argument. So there, it's like, well, but there's probably some insight behind there, right? And so maybe we can sort of use our tools of analysis to help direct the question to a premise, if possible. Or in the process, we expose that, nope, that question just really misses the argument entirely. Um, yeah, I like that example that you gave. That's a good one. Yeah, so undercutting defeaters. So let me just break down one more thing, and then this will be kind of my last thing. So again, just to review, you've got the two tools. So one tool
Let me
is,
before you give the last
yeah,
thing, let me just let the audience know. We are going to move to Q&A time, and what I'm looking for are arguments that you've seen. It doesn't have to be against atheism per se or against theism, but I'm going to pick those if I can, if we have enough of those. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to apply some of these things that we've talked about to this argument that you've seen. And it doesn't have to, you don't have to have it in like premise conclusion form. That's not the point. But if you have some kind of argument or objection that you've seen and you're having difficulty working through it, or you just want some more insight into it, post it in the live chat, and we're going to talk about it after Josh finishes this next point.
cool.
And I'll be looking for it as he finishes it out too. So, cool.
Yeah, so there's those two questions. So first, do the steps in that staircase actually take you to the conclusion? So is the argument logically valid? And then second, are the premises true? And when you're asking, are the premises true, you're looking for reasons to believe the premises. Now, when an objection comes to an argument, you can first ask which premise in the argument it's targeting. Then, once you've found which premise in the argument the objection is targeting, you can divide between two kinds of objections. One objection is what's called an undercutting defeater. What this objection does is it basically says, we haven't been given good reason to believe this premise. In the Valenkin article, there's an example of an undercutting defeater. We'll be talking about that in the Aftershow. It's not a rebutting defeater. It's not saying here's a reason to think the premise is false. It's an undercutting, which says we haven't been given good support or reason to believe it's true. The other kind of a defeater is the rebutting defeater, which I just mentioned, which is a positive argument that the premise is false. And both forms of objections are good objections, because if you're building a staircase to help somebody get from A to B, to see truth up on top of the staircase from other things that they see or can see, and then somebody comes along and says, but look, you haven't given me any good reason to take these first steps, well, then that's enough to make the argument unsuccessful for that person. They can't get anywhere without any good reason, without any sight of those first steps. The more powerful objection is to say, not only don't we have good reason to believe the steps, but here's a reason to think those steps are false. So don't step there because that's false. But those are two kinds of objections, and you can watch for that. You can ask yourself, is this an undercutting objection that tells us there's no good reason to believe the premise, or is it a rebutting objection? And
What philosopher actually originally made that distinction? I remember seeing it the other day.
I don't remember the origin, but it's pretty well known in epistemology to make that distinction between those defeaters. And I just have to just emphasize, like, these tools, these two questions: is it valid? What are the reasons for the premises? And then, does the objection target a premise? Is it undercutting or rebutting? Those tools, those basic questions right there, are so powerful. They're so organizing, and you can apply them to any argument. And if you do that, you'll save yourself so much time. Because have you ever been in a conversation where, like, it goes on endlessly, gets more and more complex? It's like, what's going on is more arguments are being introduced. But if instead you're asking which premise in the original argument, and you're separating other arguments to the side, it helps you to stay focused, helps you to make progress. And I have to say, I've had many conversations where this works. I mean, it leads to progress, where everybody's learning something. And maybe
here's another question that I have for you. So how do you do it in a way that doesn't make you seem pretentious or, like how do you do it
I think it's going to depend on the context, but
because I feel like it'd be real easy to be like, okay, well, what are you actually trying to say? Kind of thing. It's like you're trying to get them to slow down and stuff, but it can come off like pretentious.
This is my best answer to that, and this is something that I feel internally, which is that if I have a motive in the conversation to serve the other person, that somehow gets felt. If that's really my motive. If my motive, and sometimes this is my motive, like I want to sort of demonstrate my strength, that gets felt. It's almost like that's prior to the language and the words you use. So I find, like, if I have a motive to serve the other person and I detect that within myself, then out of that flows sort of the right presentation. I mean, I might just say, hey, that's really interesting the way you're setting that up. Help me see, what I'm missing here, because this is how I'm understanding your argument. Like, tell me if I'm right about that. Put it in that sort of question form, like, help me see what I'm missing. That's very powerful, and I find that does lead to kind of a successful exchange where it's not coming across pretentious. But if I say, it looks like the only way your argument could be valid is if you're presupposing this premise, which is obviously false. Well, that's going to give a different feeling if you say
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
To just put my stamp of approval on basically everything you said here, this is one of the books that I was reading early on in my apologetics career, if you want to call it that. And it's called God, Freedom, and Evil by Alvin Plantinga. It's one of my favorite books ever, in fact. And it's actually really short. You can see how thin it is. And what he does basically in talking about the problem of evil, which is what he starts the book out discussing, is he breaks down like this triad, this supposed inconsistent triad. God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, evil exists. And supposedly those three can't all be true, says Mackey, according to Mackey. And what he does is he shows that like actually it doesn't follow that God doesn't exist from these three premises. And then he goes out and tries to like look at different premises and plug them into the argument and be like, does this make it valid? Or does this lead to the conclusion? And then beyond that, he also starts to question, well, is this premise even true? Supposing it does get us to like a formally valid, formal contradiction, then are the premises even true? So that's basically what he does in this. The reason why I'm bringing this book, is because it really changed my thinking in realizing that you don't have to be like insecure about an argument, or someone who puts an argument forward. You don't have to like get upset or start to reason irrationally, because what you want to do is you want to just like start listing out the steps and get real logical with it, at least starting out, so that you can figure out, okay, what are the steps? Let's find an argument that is valid, and then let's start to ask whether or not the premises are true. And when you can like back out and do that, then it can kind of take you out of it too, because like our emotions play a big part in our emotional responses and reactions to stuff. And a lot of times it's our emotions that are leading to irrational conclusions. And so when you can get that out of the picture and just really think about, okay, well, let's like back away, despite what I believe already as a theist or as an atheist, despite what I already believe, let's just look at the argument itself and try to figure out, is it valid? And then start looking at whether or not the premises are true. And you can do that. The second part, asking whether or not the premises are true, is probably going to start to rise the emotions and stuff again. But it's something that can be done. And it's something that Alvin Plantinga does in this book. It's really, really great. I highly recommend that book if you haven't already. But we have a bunch of questions and objections and arguments that people have already put in the live chat. Did you have anything else that you wanted
just
to say?
echo what you just said about pursuing clarity, because you can pursue clarity, and that's a mutual goal that you and your interlocutor will have. Let's say you're in a conversation with someone who disagrees with you. Those are great conversations because you can learn the most. And you'll especially learn the most if you pursue clarity first, right? There's a verse for that, be quick to listen, slow to speak, sort of a thing. It's like you're actually entering into their perspective, pursuing clarity, and just sort of seeing, okay, what's being said here, and letting sort of logic unpack that. And yeah, Plantinga does an excellent job doing that in that citation you mentioned. And it slows things down, helps you to get clarity, and helps you to separate one thing from another. So
yeah, and then it might also help you see that premises can be challenged in ways that you never really thought were even possible. And it takes getting your mind working and thinking creatively about, what would it take for this premise to be true? What would it take for it to be false? Can I think of any counterexamples? And all that kind of stuff just requires like literal, cognition, thinking, and imagination. You've got to be creative, and that's just something that I don't know that it takes
work.
Yeah, it takes work.
It takes effort. You have to like decide to do the harder thing. That's the only way you're going to build a beautiful house, which is my metaphor for a good argument.
All right, so let's move into, well, first let me just tell everybody what we have planned after this. So we're going to do an after show again tonight, and what we're going to be talking about is Valinkin's article that I referenced in part 2 of my response to Rationality Rules on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. And we're going to be talking about the full article that Valinkin uses, because he says in the article that there are no viable models of an eternal universe, or at least cosmologists don't have any viable models of an eternal universe. But then he also goes on to argue against the Kalam Cosmological Argument. He doesn't attack the second premise. He doesn't attack that the universe began to exist, because he obviously believes that, and he says so in the article. But he does attack the first premise, and he gives a couple reasons for thinking that the first premise is false. And so what we're going to do in the after show is kind of break that down, and we're going to use some of the principles that Josh gave in this, and we're going to break that down from Alexander Vilenkin and show that, yeah, we're just going to analyze it. All right, so let's get back to, let me pull up my scene here, and let's get to the first argument that we're going to look at. He says, this is from Kyle Page. I know Cameron went into this a bit in another video, but what about the objection to the first premise of the Kalam, nothing begins to exist, since it's just rearranged from pre-existing material?
You want me to answer that?
Yes.
So okay, yeah. So let's apply the tools. Okay, so let's think about the argument. So the first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Okay. Second premise, the universe began to exist. So now, if the objection is saying that nothing begins to exist, okay, then which of those premises is being targeted? What's the target there? It looks like it's the second premise, right? Because the second premise says that the universe began to exist. I actually think there's a way of translating the objection into a defeater of the first premise, and it might actually get to the root of the objection. But on the surface, and this is why it takes work, because you have to really think with your interlocutor to really get to the roots, because maybe it's hard to articulate what the root is. But on the surface, it looks like it's just targeting that second premise, is saying nothing begins to exist. And then in your video, Cameron, you just pointed to the evidence or arguments that has been put forward for a beginning of the universe, including the Vilenkin article. So that would be sort of an initial analysis there. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say let's look at that a little bit further. What interpretation did you have that would turn it into a refutation or an objection to the first premise? Because I agree that I think that's sort of what's behind it.
Yeah. So so remember
maybe it's targeting the inductive evidence that we have in support of the first premise. Is that what you're thinking?
That's what I'm thinking exactly, right? So the two kinds of defeaters. There's a rebutting defeater that would say, okay, here's a reason to think the premise is false. Well, it doesn't look like it's giving a reason to think that it's false that whatever begins to exist has a cause. That doesn't seem quite right. But maybe what it's doing is it's giving an undercutting defeater. It's saying, we don't really have good reason to think it's true, because we don't have any experience with anything that has a beginning, other than, let's say, the universe had a beginning. Okay, fine. That's the only thing that had a beginning from nothing, right? But everything else is just a rearrangement from prior materials, and that's not a real absolute beginning. And I think so the worry is that the thought is that the person who's giving the Kalam argument is not just saying that whatever is rearranged has a cause, but instead is saying that whatever has a beginning in this sort of deep absolute sense has a cause. And then the worry is that we don't really have any good evidence for that. We don't have a good inductive sample, as you put it. And I think maybe that is getting really to the heart of the objection. Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
I agree.
So, before I respond to that, I want to just make clear these sort of different ways of interpreting that particular objection.
And this was actually something that was difficult to do with Rationality Rules, because I was going through the same kind of process with him, trying to figure out, okay, well, what is he really trying to say? And that's why in my response to objection 3, I was saying, after I played Stephen's clip and then I played Blake's clip, I then went back and I said, well, what is he really trying to say? And it seemed like he was trying to object to the second premise of the Kalam, that he doesn't think that our reasons for thinking the universe began to exist apply to whatever happened before the Big Bang. And so that's why I went into the arguments for the second premise. And that's the additional thing that I provided in addition to Blake's response. And so I went through the same process of trying to do the charitable thing and try to figure out, well, what is he trying to say behind the objection? Maybe it wasn't really clear what he was trying to say, but this is what I think he was trying to say. And so yeah, but let's respond to that then.
Yeah. And clarity is relative to the person, right? So it's always pretty clear to the person giving the objection, right? And that doesn't mean it's clear to everybody. And I thought that from what I could tell, you guys addressed both forms of the defeater, both the rebutting and undercutting. But yeah, so here's kind of how I would think of. There's many things to say about, why I think that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And first of all, I just want to clarify that we can just leave begins to exist open as a general. We don't have to specify how it begins. whether it begins from prior materials or it begins from nothing, is not built into the definition of begins. So we can just use a sort of ordinary language like this, this cup began to exist. Okay. And if you say, no, this didn't begin from nothing, it's like, okay. Well, it began in this more general sense that leaves open how it began. Okay. And I think that general thing is what the Kalam argument is about. It's people say it's an equivocation. You're focusing on this kind of beginning and then this other kind of beginning. It's like, no. We're not focused on any particular version of beginning. We're just focused on the more general thing. It would be sort of like if I don't know, like if you just like red things, like red is your favorite color, but you don't like care which shade of red maybe. And somebody says, oh, you're equivocating. You like, this is dark red, but this is light red. It's like, no. All I'm talking about is just like red in general. And so I think that's the way that the Kalam argument is most charitably interpreted, that it's not an equivocation. It's just talking about beginning in the general sense. And then, why I think that whatever begins to exist has a cause? Well, there's many examples that support that general principle. And there are no counterexamples that disconfirm that general principle. And that right there is a bit of evidence. We could talk about whether there are counterexamples. But, this cup began to exist and it came from prior states, causes. Yeah. And furthermore, because if you think, well, maybe things could come to be from nothing. That's the only way you could come to be uncause, is if it comes to be without prior states. But if that's possible, then it is a bit puzzling why we don't witness new universes coming into being without prior conditions. Now, I know people will say, well, it's because there's already a universe and that somehow prevents them. But how does existing stuff keep brand new chunks of matter from coming into being? If that could happen, at one time, why couldn't that happen at another time? And I think the reason for the Kalam for that causal premise, one of the arguments is that it's a simple and best explanation of all empirical data. It predicts our observations, and there's no observation that disconfirms it. Leaving open, again, how things are caused, because maybe it's caused indeterministically, like in quantum events, perhaps. Maybe it's even caused from prior states. I mean, some people have even suggested that God sort of creates the universe from himself. If you think that it can't come from nothing, then finally it comes from God in some sense. That's all consistent with the premise. So
yeah, so we're talking about analyzing, and now we've kind of moved into like responding to arguments. But I think that it's important, or it'd be helpful to give another type of response that you could give. So sometimes you can argue against the objection that they're trying to give, and you can show, well, actually, I don't agree with that. There's reason to think that this is false. But sometimes you can be like, okay, well, let's just assume that that's like a good objection, and then let's just weaken the principle, change the principle to avoid the objection, and then we can still get like the relevant conclusion that way. Do you think that's a good way of responding to?
Yeah, sometimes just clarifying. I mean, I was in a conversation with somebody who suggested to me that virtual particles come into being without any cause. And then my initial response was to say, well, I mean, is it that they have no cause, or is it that they have an indeterministic cause? And then their response back, this was a logic professor, and his sense was that our use of the term cause precludes a mere probabilistic cause. So he was thinking the cause has to be sufficient for the effect. And then at that point in the conversation, what I suggested was, well, let's not use the term cause, let's use the term condition. So the virtual particles come from some prior condition that makes them, puts them into the realm of a probability, or at least makes them possible. And then that seemed to get around that particular objection. So he was happy to continue with the argument. And so, yeah, I think that's a nice way of really keeping your eyes on truth and not like getting distracted by almost like a dialectical, obstacle. It's like, oh, well, that's just a matter of clarifying what we mean. The root of the argument is that things aren't just like coming from just like complete nothing, right?
Yeah, there's more to say, because we were talking about how this targets like the inductive evidence in support of premise one. But if you read Dr. Craig's published work, he gives 3 different arguments in support of the first premise. And so one of them is inductive, that comes at the end. But the other 2, the first one is metaphysical intuition, and then the second one is a philosophical argument where he talks about root beer and Beethoven. Why don't these things just come into being out of nowhere? And that's sort of what you were talking about. So there's different types of support that are in support of the first premise of the Kalam. And so you can focus on the inductive evidence and try to undermine the inductive evidence, but you haven't touched the other support. And so that's why it's important that you can't just, rely on undercutting. Even if you are successfully undercutting one leg out of the support system, you've got to deal with the other two. You've got to deal with all of the support that's going in defense of the first premise, and that maybe that goes back to your point of like, okay, you can accept that this is a good argument in one case, but then still weigh the total evidence and be like, well, where does the total evidence lie, or where does that take us, right?
Yes, and if you think of it as kind of like a journey, because at this part in the dialectical journey, if we could call it that, we've just identified 3 different supports for that causal premise interpreted in a certain light. Now, it might be that somebody has gone a few steps further and they're very aware of those 3 supports and they have objections to each one of them. So they're listening to this and they're thinking, well, yeah, but I mean, all 3 of those are completely undercut for these other reasons, right? That's like the next step in the dialectical journey.
Yeah.
And so all I'm suggesting here is that in our analysis, we're not coming down to a kind of victory here. What we're doing is sort of illustrating and modeling how you take those further steps along the journey in your analysis. So there's still more to consider.
So let's go on to, and I think that's really helpful. That's a really good point to make. So this one is from Iden. I think that's how you pronounce it. Iden Peterson. He says, here's a possible formulation of this argument. Premise 1, if God exists, he is timeless. Premise 2, if he is timeless, he can't create a finite universe. Premise 3, the universe is finite. Conclusion, therefore God isn't the creator.
So I'm still thinking about that first premise. So philosophers of time.
I was going to say, did you hear the rest of the premises, or were you just stuck on that
I got
first
stuck
one?
on that first one. Sorry. I got very focused. I mean, I did sort of hear them. You're reminding me of a bad conversation with my wife where she's talking about something and I get stuck. And she's talking and I need to be listening to her, but I'm not. But yeah, we got to look at those premises one at a time, right? So I get very focused. But yeah, so philosophers of time will debate God's relationship to time. So first question I would want to ask is, why I think that if God exists, God is not existing in time.
Well, let me slow you down because you're getting ahead of yourself. Because in the first thing that you did in this interview was you talked about validity, and we haven't talked about validity first. So let's look at validity first, and then we can talk about soundness. How about that?
I violated my own rules. Yes, I need to start with that first question. Is it valid? And then which? Okay, thank you for keeping me.
Because remember, you even gave an example of some premises.
See, it takes work. You can know the tools and fail to use them, right? Yeah.
Okay, so let's test to see if this is valid first. So the first premise is, if God exists, he is timeless. Stop thinking about the truth of it. Premise 2, if he is timeless, he can't create a finite universe. That's okay so far. Premise 3, the universe is finite. That's also fine. But then the conclusion, here's the conclusion. Therefore, God isn't the creator.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, I mean, that seems pretty obviously invalid because the God isn't the creator is not in any of the premises. The first premise again was, if God exists, he is timeless. Second one is, if he is timeless, then he can't create a finite universe. Number 3, the universe is finite. And then the conclusion, therefore, God isn't the creator.
So, okay, hold on. So, if the universe is finite, and from the first 2 premises, if God exists, then he creates a finite universe. Is that right? Because by transitivity?
Yeah, from the first 2, yeah. If God exists, he can't create a finite universe.
He can't. Okay.
That combines 1 and 2.
And then I think the right interpretation of the next premise is like necessarily if there is a universe, it is finite. So it's
that's not
it's going to be modus. Wait. Okay. So read that premise again. The universe is finite.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think So this is sort of maybe modus tollens, right? So the universe is finite. If God exists, he can't create a finite universe. That implies that if God exists, the universe isn't finite. But the universe is finite, therefore God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I think that would be the sort of charitable way of maybe cleaning it up a little bit so it is valid.
Yeah. I wanted to point out the fact that sometimes the wording itself just needs to be cleaned up.
Oh
And so
yeah,
that's
yeah,
so that can be something that you can help them with too, is to be like, well,
yeah.
hey, look, like let's just put it in a valid form. So because sometimes little things like that can really throw people off.
Oh yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and very good catch. I mean, in on student papers, I would have said not valid because I talk explicitly about how you got to get all the terms right for it to be valid. You can't even have synonyms. Synonyms won't work because then you need another premise that they are synonyms. So yeah,
So yeah, so there's validity, and so then we can talk about soundness.
yeah, yep.
Did you want to do that, or do you want to move on to the next one?
Well, why I think the first premise is true.
If
I'm
God
such a
exists, He
vision.
is timeless. Yeah, because that is
Yeah,
a very controversial theological view.
yes. And then the second premise, I would have to see, why I think that's true. That doesn't sort of strike me.
If He's timeless, He can't create a finite universe.
Yeah, that seems wrong. It just seems wrong to me. Um,
What I would want to do is get
yeah,
clarity on what is meant by finite universe. We talking about like
yeah,
temporally finite, so like there was a beginning point or something like that, or
yeah. But that isn't to say that there aren't ways of supporting the premises. But I'd have to see those supports. Um, and I mean, especially if you think of the argument as a servant to help somebody take that staircase, to take those steps up the staircase, then you want to deliver the argument with supports that will appeal to somebody who doesn't already believe the conclusion. Um, So, I mean, I'm really just thinking, okay, well, why I think those premises are true? Maybe there are good reasons. I'm not aware of them right now. So this would just be the beginning of a longer conversation. I have no idea, like, why those premises, especially the second premise. I mean, I can think of arguments for the first premise, even though I do tend to think that God is in time. I do know that there are some really good arguments against my view on that. So that's controversial. Yeah.
so. Let's move on to the next one because we have a few more to get through. This one is from Mordic 101, and I think he was trolling when he was saying this, but maybe we can use it as an example. He said, "Why all this talk about logic? Logic is useless. We don't need logic. We have science. Science shows the universe is big, therefore God does not exist." So, I mean, this is an objection that you hear, especially to the fine-tuning argument. Size of the universe makes no sense on the God hypothesis.
Yeah,
So
I just made a Facebook post on the relationship between logic and science. You might have seen that, but um, it was
I
just,
didn't.
yeah, okay. It came from a conversation that I had with my wife before I married her while we were dating. She was a science PhD. I was a philosopher, PhD, and we were talking about the demarcation between science and philosophy. And, naturally, as a philosopher, I made the argument that my field is the foundation for her field, right? And because my field includes logic. And then she was saying, well, but I mean, logic is part of science. I mean, this is something we use in science. And out of that conversation, I realized that I think people tend to extend the boundaries of their own field farther than what people outside of that field would tend to think. But the other sort of realization I had later, just sort of thinking about it, is that it's one thing to use some tools like logic in your field. It's another thing to discover those principles in the first place. So one of the things that philosophers do is we look for the rules of thought, like modus ponens. We talked about that. What's a valid argument for them? We look for those, we identify those, and then we can sort of hand those over to the scientists. So, I would argue that you can't even do science without logic, right? Because how could you do science? Like you make an observation and that's supposed to support some theory T, but then how do you know that observation, how do you know T is different from not T? Right? Like, I mean, if you think that, well, these observations support, I don't know, some theory of common ancestry or something, and then somebody says, but wait a minute, common ancestry and not common ancestry are the same thing. They're both true. And it's like, well, how do you know they're not both true? Well,
Yeah.
at some point you've reached bedrock. You've got to look at logic itself. So that's part of what I would want. I don't really see we can make that distinction. Of course, I just did the same thing that I did last time, which is I leaped ahead into my analysis without asking, right, what are the premises? Is it valid? That sort of a thing. But it is about the value of logic. So, and I think that once you see how logic is actually part of science, it's used by science and in science, it's really hard, I think, to make that separation, to say that one is reliable and the other is not.
So let's move on to another one. Utopia Buster 2017. Is the argument against design an equivocation fallacy? and he gave a quote: "Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose." From Crick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, which argument? Right? Because there are many arguments. Right? I mean, this is another tool that's helpful when you're analyzing objections to arguments, is to get clear what the argument is. And a lot of times people will use that word "the" before an argument type. So the argument from design, the cosmological argument.
Yeah.
But then there's many different versions, right? So I couldn't even begin to analyze the objection without seeing, okay, which design argument are we talking about? You could sort of infer from the objection maybe which one. And maybe they're referring to a version of the design argument that does commit a fallacy of equivocation. So we could just say yes.
Okay, so here's this is taking us off the topic. I guess we're talking about these arguments right now, but Brett Lunn commented in the live chat. He said, "Talk about the tool that is the phrase trivially true or obviously false."
I don't know of a tool by that name. So trivially true or obviously false. I'm trying to think of the closest thing he could be referring to.
I think he's making a joke. I think he's trying to say that some people use that. That's my guess, knowing him.
Yeah.
But
sorry.
No worries. So we have about 5 minutes left. Again, I just wanted to remind people that we are going to extend this talk. We're going to have an after show, Patreon only after show. The link to the Patreon only after show is right in the description of the video. It's really easy to get to. We're going to start the after show about 5 minutes after we end this one, which we're going to end in about 5 minutes. So, and again, just to remind people, if you've just joined us, we're going to be looking at, we're going to take the tools that Josh gave us in this interview, and we're going to apply them to Alexander Vilenkin's article where he responds to premise 1 of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. I referenced his article that he wrote. I think it was in October of 2015 that he wrote this, where he says that cosmologists have no viable models of an eternal universe. But then he also later on in the article in a different spot gave a couple objections to premise 1 of the Kalam. And so we're going to be using the tools that Josh just gave us to look at this objection, this argument a little bit more carefully and unpack it. So that's what we're doing in the after show. And we're also going to be taking questions from you guys. So if you want to join us, again, the link is right in the description of this video. So you can sign up. It's $5 a month. You get early access to after shows and everything else. And you can also support us. My goal is to be full-time with Capturing Christianity as soon as possible. So that's why we're doing a lot of this kind of stuff. So yeah. So let me see if I have another argument in live chat. I don't think we do. And I
just want to say that trivially true, obviously false reminded me of the shortest objection I've ever seen to an argument. And it goes like this: nope. I've seen that show up a few times. Just nope.
That reminds me of a joke that I don't think it was meant as a joke. Maybe it was. Alvin Plania, I think in his reply to Daniel Dennett maybe it was a paper, he said it was difficult to see what the objection was, but at least he mentioned the argument or something along those lines.
I know what you're talking about. There was an APA exchange, and it was recorded, and yeah, he had this line in there. It's difficult to see, but you did have some objection to this premise, to my first premise, and I'm grateful for that. He's like, and I'm grateful for that. It was just kind of funny, but yeah, getting clear, which premise is being targeted. It takes work. I mean, it
is not easy.
Yeah.
It is not easy. Yeah. It takes a lot. Yeah, and it's difficult to be charitable because there's emotional factors that are at play here, because you want to just defend your own view and hold your beliefs and whatever. That's the normal person. But in order to be charitable, you have to think about ways that you could be wrong. And that's what's difficult, because we are so hardwired to want to be right all the time and not to think charitably about what arguments are against your view and everything. So so here's something from Maverick Christian. He says, my suggestion, talk about ignorantio elenchil. I don't know how to pronounce these Latin words, and principle of charity.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what that is?
So, sort of what I think of when I think of being intellectually humble and charity is to put the view on a table. I had like this picture of putting it on a table so that it's not like inside of me or inside of the other person. That way I can visually be next to the other person looking at the view together. Because I think what happens otherwise is that we start to dismantle a view that is like in somebody else, and it's almost like we're dismantling a piece of that person. And that usually just does not lead to a productive conversation. But if instead I'm taking their view charitably, looking for the looking for its best light, being intellectually humble, separating myself from the argument, I'm going to be way more powerful at getting the most from them so that more of their insights flow from them to me, because everybody has insights. Anytime there's a deep disagreement, people have insights on both sides. It's not just one side has it all. And so that intellectual humility and charity is what unlocks those insights.
Yeah, so I'm waiting for. Okay, so here's something from John Robertson. Okay, and this is another argument against. Well, it's against the Kalam. It's still against the Kalam. I think it's happening in the context of the Rationality Rules back and forth. He says when scientists talk about the beginning of the universe, they're not talking about creation out of nothing. That's the objection or the argument. And he said it earlier too. Let me see if I can find it. He said all too many theists unknowingly equivocate on the definition of universe.
Yeah, no, I think that is a fair question there. So that might be targeting that second premise that the universe had a beginning, possibly. Yeah, and then it might be undercutting one kind of evidence for that, maybe. Or it might be sort of targeting a certain interpretation of the conclusion that the only way the cause could have caused the universe is to cause it from nothing. But I mean, technically, I would say that that's open as far as the argument goes, strictly speaking, because it doesn't really say how the universe was caused. I understand the sort of common interpretation is that it was caused from nothing. But as far as like what follows from those premises, the universe began to exist, and whatever begins has a cause. So the universe was then caused, but it doesn't say how it was caused. I mean, there is a view that the universe was caused from God, from God's being in some sense. I'm not endorsing that view right here. I'm not endorsing the view either. I'm just pointing out that distinction. So yeah, I think that's a valuable consideration to really get clear, what is the conclusion that comes from those premises.
Yeah, he said that you understood what he was getting at.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
That feels good.
Cool.
That's my goal.
All right, guys. Well, we're about to head over to the after show. So thanks for joining me and all of you patrons. I can't wait to see you in the live chat. We are, like I said, we're going to take Q&A too, so we're not going to spend the whole hour in the after show on Vilenkin's article, but it's going to be real laid back. It's a really great time. The first one that we did, actually, I was really hesitant doing this kind of thing because I don't like paywalls. I don't like keeping the content behind, which, by the way, we are going to release these after shows eventually, but if you sign up for early access, that's what's happening, is that you're getting early access to these videos, these after shows. So, but what I was going to say is that the last after show that we did, the first one that we did actually, and I think it was about a week ago at this point, it was really, really awesome. It was because there's a lot less people who are in the after show that are doing it live, and so you get these really cool questions from people who are really invested in the issues, and it was a great time. So I can't wait to do the next one tonight. But thanks for watching. We'll see you guys later. Have a good night. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else left to say other than Christianity's true. And I wish I would have had my outro video planned because that would have been perfect. Well, actually, look at that. It says, by the way, Christianity's true. So there you go. See you guys later.